On the night of January 30th, 1980, the digital clock above the call board read 10:17 p.m. when the red light on the emergency line came on and stopped behaving the way it usually did. Instead of blinking on and off in its normal cycle, it insisted. It blinked, switched lines, lit another lamp, and the whole room seemed to follow that rhythm, as if it were breathing along with the switchboard. Between the dry sound of keys, the click of relays, and the continuous hum of the radio, the gaps were filled with noise and urgency. The operator, Kline, 28 years old, had the headset tucked under hair that had been tied back in a hurry, and she had already written down 3 addresses on loose scraps of paper because the official form had run out in the last drawer, as happened when the call volume went beyond what was expected for a shift. Outside the Des Moines Police Department building on East 1st Street, the wind made the metal sign vibrate. Inside, the heater air was dry and smelled of hot dust, typical of ducts and radiators working without pause. That week, every minute had weight because every minute could change an outcome. Cars wouldn't start, doors froze shut, elderly people couldn't open a window to call for help, and jammed lines created a concrete distance between the voice asking for rescue and the patrol car trying to pull out of the yard, with engines demanding more from the battery and the starter. What held the night together was a sequence of small, fast decisions made by ordinary people. And Uma knew, with the uncomfortable certainty of someone who had seen too many shifts, that before the end of the night, one of them would run too late. The communications room was long and low, with worn carpet and walls painted in aged beige, lit by fluorescent tubes that gave everything a uniform tone, almost without shadow. 2 large maps of Polk County in downtown Des Moines were pinned up, marked with patrol routes in pen, with intersections and sector boundaries handwritten to make it easier to locate someone when they didn't know the exact address. A main radio, with constant static, poured out codes and street names, alternating between patrol calls and requests for backup, with interference typical of transmissions on windy, cold days. A small fan used in summer was now off and covered in dust. There was coffee in thermal carafes and a forgotten box of donuts in the corner, going hard like food that sat for hours in dry air. And each time Uma lifted the receiver from its cradle, her ear warmed. When it rang again, the opposite sensation came, as if the plastic held the icy air brought in from outside by coats and boots, burning with cold on contact. She had started that job at the end of 1978, when 911 was still new to many people there, and not everyone trusted that a single number could replace old habits. Before, residents dialed the station directly, or the firehouse, or the telephone operator. Now the short numbers seemed to promise a quick bridge, but in that record cold snap, the bridge narrowed and clogged, because the same weather event multiplied breakdowns and emergencies all at once. The KCCI forecast talked about a wind chill of 40 degrees below zero, the kind of warning that in practice meant frostbite risk in minutes and frequent mechanical failures. Water on sidewalks turned to glass. Asphalt cracked. Batteries died from 1 hour to the next, and engine oil thickened. In Des Moines, in winter, things were already hard. That week, they became a sum of small failures feeding on one another. Uma lived in a simple apartment on Grand Avenue, near the bus stop, in an area where public transit was the alternative for those without a car or those who preferred not to risk driving on ice. The building's radiator coughed and banged during the night, and she left the faucet dripping so it wouldn't freeze, a common precaution in older buildings with plumbing exposed to cold walls. Her father, who worked in a warehouse on the south side, called every day to remind her to put a blanket in the trunk and not let the tank drop below half, because low fuel could condense water and because being stuck in the cold required a reserve. Uma didn't drive. She took the bus and walked the last few blocks with her face covered by a scarf, keeping the wind from cutting her skin. That night, The scarf was still in the pocket of the coat hanging behind her chair, holding the smell of wet wool and melted snow. A quiet reminder that the cold didn't stay outside. It came in with you. The first call that stayed in her memory that night came in at 10:19 p.m., almost on top of the time when the center already seemed saturated. Uma heard short breathing, a hiss, then a woman's voice trying not to shake. Car stopped on Interstate 80 near the 2nd Avenue exit. Won't start anymore. Child in the back seat. The sentence came with the effort of someone trying to keep her mind working while her body lost heat. Uma asked for the exact location, the color of the car, the license plate number, following the data collection script that made it possible to dispatch the right unit and log the incident, because without those details, help became a blind attempt. The woman didn't know the number. Her cold hand couldn't find her wallet. Uma looked at the map and the clock, and at the same time heard on the radio that one patrol car was stuck trying to start. Another had gone to an accident on Fleur Drive, where collisions increased when the pavement became a slick layer. The decision had to be immediate. She contacted the Iowa State Patrol, passed along the details, wrote down 80 EB, 2nd Avenue exit, blue sedan, child, no heat, and kept the woman talking because keeping the line open helped update the situation and reduce the risk that the person would leave the car and expose herself. Doors locked. Windows fogged. The hiss grew louder. The call dropped twice and came back, as if the wire were being tugged by the wind, as happened when the phone network suffered from moisture and cold, turning a conversation into fragments. When a state patrol finally confirmed a unit was on the way, Uma heard a distant sound of crying, muffled by the phone, and a short phrase that changed the weight of the air. Purple lips. She told the woman to press the child's body against her, cover the head, turn on the hazard lights, keep the interior light off so as not to drain the battery, because in a stopped car, every amp mattered and the alternator wasn't recharging. It was the kind of instruction she had learned in training and that, faced with real cold, felt fragile, almost insufficient. Still, it was what stood between that child and the worst possibility. Uma's voice had to be steady and unhurried, because haste traveled down the line and infected the other side, and that night any loss of control became one more problem added to the pile. At 10:46 p.m., another line flashed. House without heat, elderly person, 1020 East 9th Street. At 11:02 p.m., accident on University Avenue. 2 cars, possible trapped injury. At 11:15 p.m., person down at the bus stop on Ingersoll. The list grew as if it had no bottom, and each incident required logging, routing, and updating, even when no patrol car or ambulance was immediately available. The shift operators, Uma and 2 others, exchanged brief, almost mechanical looks because there was no time for full sentences between one call and the next. The supervisor, a woman in her 40s named Marlene, moved behind the chairs with a clipboard and said in a low voice, almost to herself, prioritize hypothermia, prioritize fire, prioritize child, as a triage rule when resources were finite and the center had to decide who could wait and who could not. The cold that week wasn't just a number in a weather forecast. It entered the stories as a constant presence because it affected locks, pipes, fuel, electricity, and the body itself. There were people trapped at home because the lock had frozen. There were truck drivers who couldn't lift a tarp because it had turned into a rigid sheet. There were mothers trying to warm bottles in water that wouldn't come to a boil, with stoves working in cold kitchens and windows sealed shut. There were men who insisted on pushing a car on the shoulder and fainted from exertion because the air seemed to cut from the inside and the body lost heat faster than it could produce it. 911, which was supposed to be a direct line, was also a funnel. Too many voices, too little time, and the feeling that any delay, however small, accumulated until it became something irreversible. Shortly after midnight, Already on January 31st, Uma noticed the radio noise had changed. There was more silence between transmissions, as if the officers themselves were choosing words so as not to waste breath and not to occupy the channel beyond what was necessary. The patrol dispatcher warned that 2 Des Moines Fire Department ambulances were on simultaneous calls, and that response time would rise, because travel on slick streets consumed more minutes. The center couldn't invent vehicles, nor make the ice disappear. It could only set priorities and try to keep people alive until someone arrived, holding the night together with instructions, logs, and the insistence on continuing to answer. At 12:27 a.m., a call came in with a different sound, less panic and more shame, as if the act of asking for help itself were a burden. A young man, his voice tangled, said he'd seen smoke in the basement of a house on 24th Street, near Kingman Boulevard. Improvised heater, cloth nearby, small fire but smoke. Uma asked if there were people inside. Elderly neighbors. She dispatched the fire department, wrote it down, and told the man to knock on the door without going into the house, because smoke in a basement could mean risk of poisoning and rapid spread in dry wooden framing. He said the door wouldn't open. Frozen. There, the fire could be small for 1 minute and large the next. The cold snap made people risk everything to heat a room, and that brought the other danger, the one that came with flame, with kerosene, with heating elements, with improvisations that seemed like solutions until they became threats. Uma kept a personal notebook hidden in her bag, where she wrote down loose words so she wouldn't forget later. 2nd Avenue exit, University, Ingersoll, 24 to H/Kingman. She couldn't take reports home, but she could take memory, and memory was heavy. Sometimes on the bus, she saw the same streets where voices had asked for help, and it gave her the feeling of crossing an invisible map made of times and street names, a map that didn't appear on the room's bulletin boards but fixed itself just the same. At 1:11 a.m., the call that changed the shift came in online too. There was a crack, then an older woman's voice, very low, as if speaking hurt, and as if the air inside the house was already hard to breathe. Phone almost out of battery. Heat stopped. House cold. Husband on the couch. Won't get up. The address came out with difficulty. 4316 Euclid Avenue. Uma repeated it to confirm, as procedure required to avoid a dispatch error, because a wrong number that night could mean losing the little time that still existed. On the other end, the woman coughed. The sound was dry and deep, consistent with cold air and strain. Name: Evelyn Hart. Husband: Walter. Uma asked the age. 79. The voice seemed to come from a large, empty room, with the muffled sound of a house sealed to hold heat, as if the walls were trying to do a job the heating system no longer did. Uma glanced quickly at the map. Euclid Avenue was long, crossing neighborhoods, and that number was farther east. She opened the ambulance channel. Any unit available for possible hypothermia, elderly unconscious, 4316 Euclid. The reply came with interference, and even so it was clear in what mattered, all tied up. Estimated time, 30 to 40 minutes. 30 minutes at that temperature was an eternity because heat loss in an unheated environment was continuous, and because elderly people had less physiological reserve. Uma felt the back of her neck stiffen, as if her body reacted before her mind finished processing. Marlene leaned in to listen, and her tired eyes went straight to the clock, as if measuring time were the only way to keep any control. Uma returned to the line. Evelyn Hart, keep the phone close, cover your husband with blankets, close interior doors, stay in a small room. The woman said the blankets were already all on top of him, and that the small room was the kitchen, but the kitchen floor was cold as stone, as happened with floors over a basement or a cold slab. His breathing, the answer came in pieces, as if each word had to cross physical effort. Weak, mouth open, not responding. Uma told Evelyn to put her ear to his chest and count breaths. The woman made a sound as if she were getting up with difficulty. Then the phone hit something and the audio went muffled. She came back, panting, in a long time. The incomplete phrase said enough to increase the urgency and, at the same time, make clear the limit of what Uma could do from the other end of the wire. Uma's training had included CPR guided over the phone, but hypothermia in an elderly man in a cold house with no team arriving was a scenario no manual made comfortable because cold altered pulse, breathing, and the body's responses. She told Evelyn to try to warm her husband with body heat if possible, and to avoid rubbing the extremities, because that could worsen the condition in cases of hypothermia. Evelyn said a sentence that came out like a sigh. "I can't lie down on the floor. My knees hurt." Uma told her to put towels or dry clothes between his body and the couch, cover his head with a cap, use scarves, whatever she had. No open flame, no oven. Evelyn agreed with an almost inaudible yes, and in that yes there was obedience, fear, and exhaustion all mixed together. While keeping Evelyn on the line, Uma tried another route, because waiting for the ambulance without doing anything else felt impossible. On the police radio, she called for the nearest patrol car. Unit 12, possible medical assist, 4316 Euclid, elderly unconscious, ambulance delayed. The response came with the sound of an engine failing. 12 has a starting problem in the yard. Another unit, already on an injury accident. Another, en route to a burglary, priority. The whole system was stretched with simultaneous calls and slow travel, and the cold turned every trip into risk and every mechanical failure into more delay. Marlene made a short gesture for Uma to put the call on hold for seconds. Uma pressed the button, apologized, and called a police shift supervisor, a sergeant whose name she didn't use, only the rank, following the internal chain of decision. "We need someone there before the ambulance." The elderly man may not hold on. On the other end, a heavy voice said they would try to send a car, but even the cars were dying in the cold, with batteries draining and tires losing grip. Uma went back to Evelyn and heard, with a delay that felt cruel, the sound of the woman crying without strength, as if her body didn't have enough water for tears, in an environment where even humidity seemed to disappear. It was a cry that didn't ask for explanation. It simply occupied the line, reminding them there was a real house behind that address. At 1:33 a.m., Evelyn said the phone was at 10% battery, and she didn't know where the charger was. Uma told her to look without going far, to keep the phone warm inside her coat, because batteries lost charge faster in the cold. Evelyn said the coat was in the entry closet and the entryway was freezing. Uma told her to use a blanket like a cape and go slowly. The line filled with noise, shuffling steps, a door opening with a crack. Cold, very cold. Uma pictured the entryway as a small tunnel of ice, with sharper air near the exterior door, and she also pictured how each step away from her husband was an emotional risk, because the mind measures distance and guilt when time is running out. When Evelyn returned, her voice sounded farther away, as if her body were moving away from what it could still sustain. "Walter isn't breathing now." Uma closed her eyes for a fraction of a second and opened them, because there was no room for hesitation. "Put your hand in the center of his chest, hard and fast compressions." It was the standard phrase, but Uma's voice came out with a different weight, as if each word had to pass through the awareness that help still wasn't there. Evelyn made a sound of contained panic. "I can't." Uma told her to try anyway, to push with her body weight. On the other end came the sound of fabric, the creak of the couch, and a strained breath. Uma counted out loud, keeping the rhythm. 1, 2, 3. Beside her, The radio issued an alert about an accident on I-235, and the center kept turning as if it could not stop for a single house. Uma couldn't look. She counted to 30, asked for 2 breaths if possible, but Evelyn said she couldn't, that his mouth was cold, that she was afraid. Uma kept the compressions going because it was the only possible act at a distance, the only bridge that had not yet frozen. At 1:41 a.m., the call dropped. The line light blinked, but it did not come back. Uma hit redial on the internal system, which sometimes worked, but the number did not complete. She tried again. Nothing. The silence in the receiver was worse than any scream, because it brought no information and no possibility of guidance, and because silence, in that context, was a form of loss. Marlene put a hand on Uma's shoulder for a second, without a word. Uma wrote 4316 Euclid, call dropped 141, and circled it 3 times, as if the circle could hold the house on the map and keep it from becoming only a lost point, one incident among hundreds. She keyed the radio again and asked for any unit, any car, even an officer on foot, but the answer was always the same. Ice distance calls stacked up. At 1:58 a.m., a patrol car finally confirmed it was heading to Euclid. The officer said the car was sliding, that he was going slowly, as if each block required care not to skid off the road. Uma wrote down the time. Her pen failed for a second because her hand was sweaty and cold at the same time, caught between internal heat and dry air, and that tiny failure felt like a cruel symbol of how everything that night insisted on not working the way it should. While she waited for confirmation, other calls came in, and the center did not offer the luxury of standing still inside one story. A man in Beaverdale with burst pipes and risk of a short circuit because water and wiring did not mix and the cold-made tube split. A woman in the River Bend neighborhood in labor, her husband trying to start the car without success, the urgency of biological time added to mechanical failure. A teenager who had gone out to help push a neighbor and could no longer feel his fingers, a sign of imminent frostbite. Uma moved from one voice to another as if crossing different rooms in an enormous house. In each one, the same presence of cold, the same pressure of time, and the same need to turn panic into instruction, instruction into dispatch, dispatch into waiting. At 2:16 a.m., the radio crackled with the officer's voice on Euclid. Arrived on scene. No response at front door. Lights off. Attempting contact. Uma held the receiver with both hands, as if she could hear better, though she knew it was only noise and transmission. The officer came back. Door unlocked. Entering, there was a stretch of static, and in that stretch fit everything the center could not see. Then, female located, conscious, very cold. Male on couch, no apparent pulse. The phrase, no apparent pulse, was said with the care of someone who knew words could break a person, even when no one in that room showed it outwardly. Uma wrote it down, feeling her stomach drop, and at the same time knowing there were still procedures, still logs, still the rest of the shift. The ambulance still had not arrived, tied up on other calls and on difficult streets, and the distance between what was needed and what was possible remained the same. At 2:29 a.m., the ambulance confirmed arrival. The radio carried sounds of voices in the background, footsteps, equipment, the technical routine of a team entering a cold house with medical gear. Then came the confirmation Uma did not want to hear, but had already imagined from the moment the call dropped. Male pronounced dead on scene. Female transported to Iowa Methodist Medical Center for hypothermia. The phrase dead on scene entered the room like a heavy object. There was no scream, no scene, only the sequence of words and the clock moving on, as it always did, indifferent to what those words meant for the person who had heard them first. Uma kept the receiver to her ear, for one more second than she needed, listening to the channel static, as if the static could offer something besides continuity. She thought of Evelyn trying to find a charger in the dark, with her husband's body cooling on the couch. She thought of the phone dropping, the battery dying before help arrived, and the way the cold accelerated every small failure, pushing everything to the edge. None of it was a crime. None of it was a bad choice. It was a set of things the cold pushed to the breaking point. Even so, death had an address, a time, a name, and now it was on a sheet of paper in front of her, with the dry formality of a record that had to exist so the system could keep functioning. Marlene told Uma to stand up for 2 minutes, go to the sink, drink water. The sink was in a short corridor with cinder block walls, where the radio sound arrived muffled, as if it came from another room, another life. The water ran cold, as it did in buildings where the pipes also suffered from the outside temperature. Uma washed her face and went back, because there was no time for more. At 3:05 a.m., a call came in from a man trapped in his car on I-35 near Ankeny, the exhaust blocked by snow and the interior smelling of gas, a known risk of carbon monoxide in a stopped car. At 3:22 a.m., an elderly woman in Sherman Hill with dizziness and confusion, a kerosene heater inside the house, a kind of heat used when the main system failed and that required ventilation many avoided because of the cold. Each call seemed to carry a hard, repeated lesson. In the cold, improvisation could kill as fast as the ice itself, and the center had to recognize that without moralizing, only with precision. At 4:10 a.m., the center received word that the city of Des Moines would open an emergency shelter at the Veterans Memorial Auditorium on 3rd Street for those without heat. The news ran over the radio, and soon after began to come in through calls. People asked how to get there, whether there would be blankets, whether they would accept animals, whether the bus would be running, because traveling in the freezing early morning was itself a risk. Uma gave instructions carefully, citing intersections, telling people to cover their faces, bring documents, shut off the gas if it was safe, and avoid candles and camp stoves. She knew many would not go, out of stubbornness or fear of leaving the house. But the simple existence of a warm place felt like a small victory against the night, a concrete response in a situation where so many responses were only promises of on the way. At 5:02 a.m., while the sky was still dark, Uma received a call from hospital. A nurse at Iowa Methodist asked for confirmation of a family contact for a patient named Evelyn Hart. The nurse's voice was professional, but there was a fatigue that matched the center's, the fatigue of a shift during a mass event, when the work becomes a sequence of decisions without pause. Uma searched the log, found the name, and saw there was no relative's number recorded, only the address. Evelyn had called alone. Uma had nothing more to offer beyond what was already on the paper, and that too was part of the limit. The center could connect resources, but could not create ties where it had not been possible to record them. Uma's shift ended at 6 a.m., but on that kind of night, no one left exactly on time, because the night did not respect a time clock. At 5:48 a.m., the radio warned that the temperature had dropped further and the wind remained strong, keeping the wind chill at a dangerous level. The shift change arrived with pale faces and red eyes. Someone brought another bottle of coffee. Uma handed off the pending incidents, her voice low and precise, as if each item were an object that had to be passed without being dropped. When she reached the item, 4316 Euclid, Walter Hart, dead 229, Evelyn transported, she said it without trembling, as the job required and as the whole room seemed to require in order to keep functioning. Even so, as she handed over the paper, her hand hesitated for an instant, as if releasing that information into the world would let it fall again, now beyond the reach of any procedure. On the morning of January 31st, 1980, The sun appeared weak over Des Moines, a pale disk behind thin clouds. The air outside cut the same way, as if the city had not received the news that the night was over. Uma went out the side door of the building, pulled up her scarf, and walked to the bus stop. The concrete creaked under boots, with crusts of ice in the corners and salt piled where vehicles had passed. A salt truck went by slowly, scattering grains that bounced like small dark seeds, trying to give traction to the main streets. On the corner, a man slapped the hood of his own car, irritated, and the sound seemed distant, as if the cold swallowed everything in muffled, even anger, reducing the city to restrained movements. On the bus, the windows were fogged, and people sat with hunched shoulders, holding bags and thermoses. No one talked much. The whole city seemed to be in conservation mode, saving energy, with stores opening later and people avoiding going out without need. Uma looked out the window and saw Euclid Avenue pass at some point, long and ordinary, with wooden houses and leafless trees, roofs with hardened snow, and low chimney smoke where heat still worked. She did not know which one was number 4316. She might have passed right by without noticing. That was part of the wait. The extraordinary happened behind ordinary walls, and the center saw only sound, touched other people's lives only by a thread that could drop. In the days that followed, the cold snap continued, and the center stayed crowded. On February 2nd, the temperature rose a little, and people began to go out more, as if the city were breathing again, still careful on the sidewalks. Uma returned to work, because the work did not stop and because routine was at the same time protection and reminder. She took a call for a small garage fire on Merle Road, for a fall on a sidewalk on Woodland Avenue, for a baby with fever in Altoona. With each call, her body remembered Evelyn Hart without her wanting it to, as if memory had learned a shortcut. It was not guilt taking shape. It was an awareness of the limit, a mark of what had not been possible when response time was longer than a body could endure and when the cold turned minutes into borders. On Monday, February 4th, 1980, Uma saw a short notice in the Des Moines Register in the obituary section. Walter Hart, 79 years old, resident of Des Moines, died on January 31st. The notice said little, like most of them, mentioning the church, visitation time, the cemetery, with the standard formality of paid, brief announcements. It did not mention the center, or the phone, or the cold inside the house. Still, it was confirmation that the name on the paper had an entire life behind it, and that the center had touched only the last stretch, the narrowest stretch. Uma folded the newspaper and kept it in her coat pocket for a day, then threw it away, because there was no appropriate place to keep it, neither at work nor at home, and because carrying the notice did not change what was already recorded. By the end of that week, when the cold finally eased and the city returned to a more normal winter, the center also seemed to slow a little. The red lights still came on, but there were now seconds of breathing room between one and the next, and the radio carried less continuous urgency. On a Saturday afternoon, Uma passed a hardware store on Ingersoll and saw a stack of battery cables and portable electric heaters in the window with a handwritten sign, "Prepare for winter." She thought of how many people only prepared after something irreversible happened, not out of carelessness, but because they lived at the edge of money, time, and attention, postponing maintenance, equipment purchases, and heating checks until the moment the system failed and the cost stopped being financial and became human. In March, the streets began to show patches of earth. Snow turned into dirty water in the gutters, and buses went back to running late because of mud instead of ice. Uma kept sitting in the same chair, using the same headset, writing down the same intersections, with the same map pinned up. Sometimes a call came from someone lost on I-80 on a rainy night, or from a house without power after a storm, and she felt her body stiffen the same way it had during the cold snap because the job had taught her that any night could tighten the world until it became narrow, and that the difference between routine and emergency could be a technical detail that failed, an engine that wouldn't start, a line that dropped, a battery that died before help arrived. The heart case file remained stored in a metal drawer alongside hundreds of others, on paper that yellowed with time and staples that slowly rusted. There was no ceremony for it, no formal closure for the person who took the call. Closure came in other ways: the bus arriving, the apartment radiator banging, the sound of a kettle, an afternoon when the phone rang less. The city went on, as it always does, with its blocks and routines, but inside the center there was a quiet knowledge that, in those January hours, the distance between a home and a hospital had been measured in battery life, in ice on asphalt, in an engine that wouldn't start, in a line that dropped. When the winter of 1980 became a memory, and people went back to talking about it as that terrible cold, what remained most clearly recorded was the way a voice on the other end of the line could disappear before help arrived, and how, even so, someone had to keep answering the next red light, writing down the next address, holding the city together with short, precise word while the wind still made the building's sign vibrate. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like the video. It helps these often forgotten stories find the audience they deserve. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We'd love to hear from you as well. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. This community stretches across places, generations, and personal histories, brought together by a shared respect for the past. Thank you for being here, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.